Hi, I'm Anita Weinberg. I am the co-chair of the Clarence Darrow Commemorative Committee, and on behalf of the committee, which includes Nina Barrett and Nina Helstein and Tracy Boehm, we want to welcome you to this evening's program and to thank the Harold Washington Library Center and Chicago Public Library, and especially Mariella Colon, for partnering with the Darrow Committee to keep Darrow's spirit alive and to sponsor this evening's program. The title of the program, 100 Years After the Scopes Monkey Trial, Book Banning in 2025. I want to tell you just a little bit about the Darrow Commemorative Committee. The core commission of the Darrow Commemorative Committee is to cultivate and enhance the enduring values and principles that Darrow held dear. We do this through an annual event on every March 13th, the day that Darrow died. It's been going on since 1957, and we do it at the Clarence Darrow Bridge, which is right behind the Museum of Science and Industry. And then we also do it through an annual lecture, debate, or discussion in which those timeless ideas that Darrow held are deliberated and applied to current events and problems. We actually have, if anybody's interested, a sign-up sheet if you want to be able to be on our mailing list. All we will send you is information a little before March 13th. We usually try to have the morning program at the bridge, and then an evening program at some other venue. Each year we focus, the mailing list, if you want to sign on, is outdoors, outside, where the books are being sold, and Nina will be telling you a little bit more about that. Each year we focus on a relevant topic, an issue, or challenge of the day that also existed when Darrow was alive. And those of you who have been here before have heard me say that sadly, selecting a topic is way too easy. Darrow, who was born in 1857, so over 160 years ago, used his pulpit, whether it was in the courtroom, on the debate stage, or in his writings, to challenge threats to labor unions, to workers, to freedom of religion and speech, to government's approach to addressing crime and punishment, prison conditions, and to how we think about immigration, racial discrimination, poverty. Is it sounding a little too familiar? This year is the 100th anniversary of the Scopes Evolution Trial, which was in Tennessee, in which Darrow defended a high school teacher charged with violating a law that prohibited teaching the theory of evolution. Specifically, it said, any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. During the trial, Darrow commented to one of the other attorneys, isn't it difficult to realize that a trial of this kind is possible in the 20th century in the United States of America? And W.E.B. Du Bois believed, he said, that democracy itself was on trial. One thing I want to get across, this is my own personal piece, is I want you to know, before we even begin the discussion, that I think this story illustrates how everyday people can play a critical role in challenging decisions that are made by our government or lawmakers. This case begins in a drugstore in Dayton, Tennessee, where John Scopes, a 24-year-old high school teacher, was standing around talking to a few other people in that drugstore about the anti-evolution, teaching the law, making it illegal to teach evolution in the classroom. And one of those present, a mining engineer, suggested that Dayton act as a test case against the new law. And he suggested that Scopes teach evolution in his classroom and see what happens. And so Scopes agreed to do that. He went into the classroom. He taught about the theory of evolution. The people he had been speaking with, as agreed, called the authorities, and Scopes was indicted. But it all began with the 24-year-old high school teacher and a discussion in a drugstore. So our panel is going to pick up the story from there. I want to introduce Nina Barrett, who's going to tell you a little bit more about tonight's program and serve as a moderator. Nina, in addition to being on the Darrow Commemorative Committee, is the author of a book on Darrow's Leopold and Loeb case, and also is the owner of an independent bookstore in Evanston, Illinois, called Bookends and Beginnings. Nina?
No. Is that? There we go. Okay. Hi. We're working now. Okay. Um, yes, I want to definitely second what Anita just said about uh, it not ever being hard to find a resonance in Darrow's words for things that are going on today. We started talking about this program about a year ago because we knew this 100th anniversary was coming up. So we've been planning it for a year, but in this case, these issues that were being debated in a Tennessee courtroom 100 years ago could easily have jumped out of today's headlines. We are going to pick up the story around where Anita left off. And since I'm a bookseller, I thought the way to do that would be to talk to the author of the best book that's out on the subject right now, which is a wonderful book called Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation by Brenda Wineapple. And I brought the books, so they are for sale. If you really want to read about this in detail, it's a kind of irresistibly page-turning account of the entire trial. Unfortunately, Brenda couldn't be here tonight. She lives in New York. But I was able to tape an interview with her on Zoom that we're going to show in just a minute. That will just set the stage for the live conversation that we're going to be having with the two panelists who are here sitting to my left. To the far left, we have Rebecca Glenberg, who is the Chief Litigation Counsel for the First Amendment at the ACLU of Illinois and was previously the legal director of the ACLU of Virginia. And what you need to know about her is that she's such a lifelong fan of Clarence Darrow that her sadly recently deceased dog's name was Darrow. Joyce McIntosh in the middle here is the assistant program director for the Freedom to Read Foundation, which is related to the American Library Association, which is dedicated to First Amendment education, litigation, and advocacy. And she has done a lot of work helping librarians navigate challenges in their school and public libraries, which are coming up more and more. So, now to tell the story of the Scopes monkey trial, which of course had nothing to do with monkeys, I would like to virtually welcome Brenda Wineapple to the screen.
Scopes trial, or the monkey trial, is basically a trial that happened in Dayton, Tennessee in July of 1925, because the state legislature of Tennessee a few months before had passed something that was called the Butler Act. And what that really was that it forbid the teaching of any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man is taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that we've descended from a lower order of animal. All right, in other words, what that act said is that God had created humans in his own image, and that the first humans, Adam and Eve, pretty much looked like us, who looked like God, which is to say, Darwin was out the window, the theory of evolution was out the window, the history really of the planet Earth was out the window. The discoveries of geologists, archaeologists, philologists, all of it was irrelevant to this particular law. And when the easiest way to understand this is when this law was passed, the American Civil Liberties Union understood that this might be for them a good test case of a constitutional issue, because the constitutional issue was the First Amendment, the separation of church and state. And so how can you say that actually things that are known, history, geology, science, biology can be omitted and from the curriculum in place of a biblical theory. So, or a biblical point of view. And that particular point of view, just to be clear, is a very specific reading of the Bible that all religionists, whether they were Protestant or Catholic, did not necessarily believe. In other words, the literal interpretation of the Bible was that of religious fundamentalists in the middle of the 1920s. So the ACLU thought this would be a good test case for constitutional issue, and they advertised and they said that anyone who was willing to break the law, they would back and they would defend in the court. John Scopes, who was teaching biology in Tennessee, in Dayton, Tennessee, young biology teacher, said that you can't teach biology without teaching evolution. So he stepped up. He was willing to be the guinea pig, essentially. When Clarence Darrow, very famous labor lawyer, criminal lawyer at this particular time, heard that this was happening, he volunteered pro bono, without a fee, to take on the defense, as well as the ACLU, or with the ACLU, of John Scopes. At the same time, William Jennings Bryan, a three-time Democratic nominee for president, was asked by a fundamentalist organization, fundamentalist religious organization, to prosecute the case. And as far as he was concerned, this was an offer that he really couldn't refuse, because he believed, and he said that that Darwin was a text. He didn't really understand what it was, but that Darwin's words were full of irreligious and atheistic point of view. So in that sense, he believed that the liberal clergy, most of the clergy, that were really grooming children in the public schools to become atheists. So he said he would duel to the death on behalf of Christianity, which was his view of Christianity, because he believed that it was under attack. So there you've got the constituents. You've got two very, very famous lawyers, Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan, who really hadn't practiced law, but who stood for the religious fundamentalists and was a very popular figure at this time because he was a powerhouse in the Democratic Party. He had been a progressive Democrat. So you have these two figures, and then of course you have the American Civil Liberties Union, all coming to small town of Dayton, Tennessee in 1925 to battle out the issues that they felt were involved in this particular case. And they were very serious issues that, just by the way, had nothing to do with monkeys. The trial was called the monkey trial because the fundamentalists or Bryan that he represented, and he himself believed that Darwin said we're all descended from monkeys. Darwin never said that, but that was how his theory had come to be popularly understood. So hence the journalist H.L. Mencken called this event the monkey trial, and it stuck. Bryan wanted to do was to enforce, from I think our point of view, he wanted to enforce moral behavior and thereby revive the values that he associated with a white, rural, decent, and upstanding America. That is America that he thought he represented and he tried to represent. So that was very important to him. And so when he said he would duel to the death on behalf of Christianity, he was quite serious about it because he really felt that it was under attack, and he blamed many of the concerns of the 1920s, from the unequal distribution of wealth to the effect of awful war, World War I, he blamed it, or he laid it all at Darwin's feet. And that was William Jennings Bryan. So he was quite serious about what he was doing. This was not a joke to him. Now, Clarence Darrow was just as serious and just as committed, because what he wanted to do was fight against what he believed was an attempt to turn the country into a bigoted and intolerant theocracy, where one and only one version of the Bible could be taught. I mean, he was an agnostic, not an atheist. He said he just didn't know if there was a God or not. But on his defense team, or on the defense team, was a practicing Catholic and a secular Jewish person. So he was saying that the point of view that Bryan represented and that Butler Act represented was narrow, unfair, unconstitutional, and ultimately tolerant. So that was his point of view, and he himself, that's why he came to Dayton, because he was quite impassioned by this trial, which he wanted publicly known as to be broadcast in the papers. The ACLU came to the trial also very strongly believing in constitutional protection of freedom to worship or not to worship. And they felt that it was a constitutional issue that should be argued solely on those grounds. So those were the really great issues that were at stake. And they were very powerful issues, and they really cut right to the heart of democracy. Because in one sense, and the great scholar, Black scholar and thinker W.B. Du Bois said, democracy itself was on trial in Dayton, Tennessee. That's how he summarized the trial in that sense. So the issues were I think they were moving and poignant, as well as somewhat abstract, if you think of the Constitution as more abstract, but they really affected how people live their lives. The outcome of the trial is actually very interesting in several ways. The Tennessee Supreme Court heard the appeal, but in a sense really wouldn't touch it. And what they had said was that the judge in the trial had mistakenly put the fee or the punishment of John Scopes, $100, when that amount of money was supposed to be determined by the jury. So in a sense, the whole issue, all of the issues, the very powerful issues of the trial were sidelined when it got to the Tennessee Supreme Court. And what happened in Tennessee itself was that people more or less walked away from this particular trial. The religious fundamentalists who had won, but the victory that they had won in the courts, they had really lost, excuse me, they had really lost in the court of public opinion. So what happened, and from one point of view, you could say that they went underground and began to organize more politically in terms of the issues that they want and are still being addressed today. The actual statute wasn't repealed, the Butler Act, until 1967. The Tennessee State Senate repealed the act, and the next year, the United States Supreme Court struck down an Arkansas law that criminalized the teaching of evolution. And in 1987, the United States Supreme Court also struck down as unconstitutional a law stipulating that something called creationism, which was like a Bryan inflected interpretation of Genesis, that really be given equal time if evolution was being taught. So it seemed that the courts were going in a direction away from the Butler Act and seemed to be addressing these issues, but they really weren't entirely. And you know, the fight really against the control of schools, of censorship, of censoring books that children can read, censoring science, all of that, which comes down to academic freedom, is still one that's being battled and discussed today, because teachers themselves, whose professional commitment is to teach, not sham science, but real science, are under threat. And as Darrow said, once you start limiting what people can teach, you start limiting what they can think, and you can start limiting their freedom of movement and all other kinds of freedoms. So you can see, both in terms of libraries and schools that are now under duress, and also in terms of the Constitution, which is also from many points of view under duress, that those issues are very much still with us.
Well, thank you. The spirit of Darrow is here, and the spirit of Brenda is also here. So we're not going to relitigate. As Brenda said, who won and who lost is not very clear in that particular case, but the issues kind of went underground. And so I thought we would just start this conversation about where are we today I would like each of our panelists to talk a little bit about their organization and how the mission of their organization engages with some of these issues that Brenda was talking about. And I was wondering if you would start, Rebecca, because the history of the ACLU is very rooted in this particular case.
Sure. And by the way, if anyone after the program wants to see pictures of Darrow, the very cute dog, you're welcome to come up and I show them to you. So the ACLU was founded in 1920, so just 5 years before the Scopes trial. And during those first few years, they were known for representing people who were not very popular: communists, anarchists, labor leaders, whose right to protest and whose free speech was being suppressed. The courts weren't really friendly to those claims at the time. So the Scopes trial represented an opportunity to really establish a constitutional principle, as Brenda said, and also to perhaps, just notch a win and get some attention for the ACLU. And in that way, it was very successful. The ACLU became a lot more popular at that point. A lot of people agreed with the ACLU's and Darrow's point of view that the Bible should not be the measure of truth in a public school classroom. So the ACLU remained engaged in that issue of religion in the schools as part of their overall mission to protect constitutional rights and civil rights. And including the cases that Brenda mentioned that came later, much later, 1967 and 1987, the ACLU was involved in both of those cases, striking down a law that was like Tennessee's, and striking down also the law that required the teaching of creationism. If you're going to teach evolution, you have to teach the other side, was the idea. But the Supreme Court said, no, you can't engage in religious indoctrination in the public schools. It actually came up again in 2005, although it didn't go up to the Supreme Court, in a local ACLU case in Pennsylvania, where a school board decided that they were going to, when evolution was taught, read a statement to their students saying that there was an alternate theory called intelligent design, and that students who were interested in that theory should read this particular book to find out more about it. intelligent design was sort of like the attempt to science up the creationism idea. And so it purportedly focused on gaps in the theory of evolution and evidence that that creation could not have taken place and humans couldn't have existed without some intelligent designer, i.e. God. And in that case, the ACLU was able to show that intelligent design was not, in fact, science, and it relied on this idea of a supernatural being, which was antithetical to how science works and how the process of cause and effect, that is, scientific inquiry works. So it's remained an issue for all of that time.
So as I read Brenda's book, I kept going, oh my word, this is happening now. This is happening now. It was just uncanny. And in listening to those clips and hearing the dates, there's so much overlap, and the arc of history is always interesting in its parallels. So I work with two organizations, the American Library Association and a separate nonprofit called the Freedom to Read Foundation. The American Library Association it's been around for over a century, and we support librarians and library workers. We're a trade organization in the same way the American Medical Association would support medical professionals. I believe it was 1967, a woman named Judith Krug said, we need an office for intellectual freedom. Think about what was going on in the country. And at that point, the American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom was formed in order to help library workers understand how to protect patrons, all of us, our First Amendment right to access information. Because our public libraries are the only limited public forum. They are set aside for one purpose, for us to access information, and every community member should be able to find something that they want in there. So that was the background with the Office for Intellectual Freedom. And what we do a number of things, but one of the most important roles is helping library workers throughout the country deal with censorship, deal with challenges, deal with hate crimes, deal with First Amendment audits. Up until 3 or 4 years ago, we had a line on our challenge reporting tool that said, is this a book, a video, a CD, or an online database? Now it says, the list I just shared, is this a challenge to a program? Is this a challenge to a material? Is this a First Amendment audit? Is this, and the list has grown and grown. So that is a key role in our work. And then the Freedom to Read Foundation came along at the same time, a year later. That is a separate nonprofit because we focus on the First Amendment, doing education litigation, that's the word that separates us from ALA, and advocacy. And as you can imagine, we've been really busy. I would like to be bored. I would like to be put out of a job. I want to go back to saying to people, you probably won't ever need this policy, but just in case, you should write it now. Now I'm like, do you have a good policy in place? Okay, do it yesterday. So we are now working in litigation. You know, maybe a few years ago we'd do 1 to 3 briefs a year. Now we're involved in over a dozen cases. So that's the work we're doing at the moment.
Yeah. So, I mean, so one of the things that came up in how, and what you both just said and what Brenda said is that I think at some point there was a notion that progress was being made. And I think of Clarence Darrow as a progressive in the like literal sense of the word. Of he believed that humans could become wiser and smarter, and we would know more things, and mysteries would be solved, and that justice would become more compassionate. And he thought we were, I think, making progress toward that, and it sounds like we were. And then I don't know. I'm going to let you address what does it look like on the ground today, because it does feel like progress suddenly.
Yeah, so in the 60s, when that first evolution case came to the Supreme Court, this was a time when the Supreme Court was also making clear that you couldn't have school prayer, you couldn't have school Bible readings. They really were policing that line between church and state, especially when it came to the public schools, and they developed an entire jurisprudence for dealing with those questions. Quite recently, they have started taking that jurisprudence apart piece by piece, starting with cases requiring, in some cases, states to make payments to religious schools. On the school prayer side, several years ago, finding that a high school football coach had a constitutional right to stand in the middle of the field after a game and give a prayer there with all of the students still in attendance. So the school thought, we have to prevent this because school prayer is prohibited, and the Supreme Court said, no, you're mistaken, he actually has a constitutional right. After that case, schools have become, or certain school districts in certain states have become emboldened to try to bring religion back into the schools. In one case that the ACLU is involved in, the state of Louisiana passed a law requiring the 10 Commandments to be posted in every school classroom. This was a practice that the Supreme Court had struck down in 1985 or so. But after this case with the football coach, people thought, maybe this is something we can try again. And likewise, Oklahoma began mandating Bible instruction in school. In that case, their own state Supreme Court struck it down. But we're seeing these encroachments. We're concerned about them. And at the same time, similar to what happened in Tennessee and what was happening in the country in the 20s, we're seeing threats to teachers and academics and real intrusions on what it is that they can and cannot teach. So we saw in Florida a bill that was popularly called Don't Say Gay, that prohibited any kind of teaching or discussion of sexual orientation or gender identity. We've seen the National Institutes of Health recently canceling a bunch of grants that they claimed promoted gender ideology or DEI, just based on the words that appeared in the grants, words like diversity. So in those two ways, the themes of the Scopes trial continue to be resonant.
All right, let me see if the chart's behind me. Yep, everyone take a look at those numbers. On some days, those numbers distress me, and I find it alarming, actually most days. But I want to explain the difference in the numbers that were low versus what they are now and what we're experiencing in our public schools and our public libraries. It used to be that we'd count one challenge that someone would report a challenge to us. This is happening in my library. I would like help with it. And it would be one parent saying, I guess I don't want Harry Potter in the library. Everyone who reads it is going to hell because it's witchcraft. They'd have a one-on-one conversation with the librarian. And then we started seeing, after the pandemic, when you start to see that number really go up, we started seeing groups organize around censorship. We started counting multiple titles per challenge. So now you had someone sending a list in saying, I want these 10, 20, 100 books removed from the library. And they would start circumventing those library policies, which are our rules. And you can't just break them because they have to uphold the First Amendment. And then now we see legislation censoring. So that's where we've gotten these huge numbers. And many days, that huge number may feel like a loss. But I find hope in the fact that the courts are saying this material's not obscene, it's not harmful to minors, it's not child porn. These are the same arguments they were making in the 1920s and then in the 1960s and then in the 1980s. So I find hope in the courts. The other area where I continue to find hope, and I'm so thankful for it, in the 1960s, a lot of authors, Judy Blume, we're all familiar with the fact that she's come back and said, you challenged this and banned this in the 80s, you can't do it now. No, you still can't do it. She came back and she said no. The late Roby Harris, who I loved, she had books, It's Not the Stork, It's Perfectly Normal, some of those first sort of sex ed books that had great drawings. They were perfect for kids, they were accessible. Those were challenged because nudity, even though it was this cute cartoon and it did explain this. Roby came back and said, no, you can't do this. So I find hope in the fact that our courts are upholding the First Amendment, our authors and all of us are still being activists.
Yeah, we'll get back to hope because we want to end on hope. Yeah, that's okay. Don't jump ahead to hope. Let's wallow around in the. Well, another subject that I wanted to bring up was just the notion of having a trial over this. And these two really great orators arguing for days over it. And Darrow always regarded a good trial as an opportunity for him to make a 3-day speech about something. But as we said at the beginning, his speeches are full of really complex, interesting, profound ideas about civil life and society. And I just have to ask you about social media, because one thing that, I think plays a big part in these attacks that we're seeing is a kind of civic dialogue that's going on at the tweet level, and that's, getting amplified in social media. So I don't know if that's something you both want to address. I see Joyce nodding.
Okay, I'll take that one. So that's another contributor to that huge number, right? I worked with a librarian who called me up and said, okay, this group told me they want these 200 books out of my library. Here's the deal. I don't own any of them. And then so she wrote back to the group and she said, sorry, but one, this isn't a proper reconsideration process, and there's nothing to reconsider. We literally don't own these in our library. And then it was a northwestern town, very small. Proud Boys had actually overtaken the local boards. And so she said, so we don't really have a problem. And they said, but wait, look at your collection development policy. You could buy these books. So they continued to go after her and ran her out of town. Social media had a big impact there. Should I keep going for one more example or no? Another example in southwest Michigan, town, Patmos Township. It is southwest of Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's a small town, but it's not far from a very cosmopolitan large city. And in Patmos Township, they said, we don't want any LGBTQ books in the library. The county board said, if you don't remove those books, we're going to defund the library. So they got it on the ballot. And people voted to remove the books and close, defund the library. Well, a few weeks later, the township board members and some other residents were like, I didn't realize that meant the library would really close. Well, if it has no budget, it's going to close. So they said, okay, we'll go back. We'll have a second vote. They voted it down again. They voted it down again. And in this instance, a lot of private citizens, some famous authors, some GoFundMes all pitched in. They have a budget. They're running private right now. But social media, the power of a community practicing that viewpoint discrimination, not following policies, no one bringing it to court, can lead to that.
Is this something you want to talk about, Rebecca, or should I ask you a different question?
I mean, my observations are very much the same. We've seen the role of social media in those book bans very profoundly.
Yeah. I guess I want to ask you about I think, what you're seeing in the courts, because I said we get to hope at the end, but it seems like we're seeing, we've also for a long time really, really, I think, relied on the idea that if these things went to court, the justices would make a enlightened decision, and we're seeing the whole tenor of judicial decisions suddenly changing.
Yeah, that's right. Although, as Joyce said, a lot of the lower courts are holding strong because there still is all of this good Supreme Court precedent that says, for example, that you can't remove books from a public library just based on their viewpoint. And so lower courts follow those precedents. As I mentioned, some state courts are really standing up for rights. Like amazingly, the Oklahoma Supreme Court on that issue of Bible readings in schools based on their state constitution found that was unconstitutional. So you have these lower courts, you have the state courts. People in my profession are very nervous about these cases going up to the Supreme Court, and wonder what would happen at that point.
Okay. All right. Let's go to Hope now. We are going to take questions from the audience, but as Anita also said in the introduction, there was this idea that the whole Scopes trial was triggered by the guy in the drugstore saying, hey, I'll stand up for this. So I'm wondering if you both can offer us any concrete examples, not just of hope, but I think the problem now is that so many people just feel powerless about what they see unfolding in the news. And I'm wondering if you have some examples of how regular people what they can do. How can they stand up? How can they help turn the tide?
Okay. So when we were seeing waves of book challenges and similar outrages around the Chicago area, particularly in some of those suburbs, one of the things we did was encourage people who wanted to stand up for freedom of speech and for books and libraries and teachers to go to these school board meetings and these library board meetings and be the opposition, because these boards were overwhelmed by crowds of people who would come and yell at them for having these terrible books, right? And so these boards needed to see that there were at least as many people who were going to stand up for the books and stand up for the freedom to read. So that's one thing. Another thing that, as a First Amendment lawyer, I'm very big on is exercising your right to protest. And the more frequent and more prominent and bigger the protests are, the more it catches people's attention, the more elected officials need to pay attention to it. So another thing that I would encourage people to do is to, if there's a particular issue that you are want to take action on, look for organizations that are doing work in that area. Often they will have email alerts that you can sign up to that will tell you when to call your legislature, state and federal, about particular actions and when to go to a protest, et cetera. And those are great resources for finding something to do to help.
Perfect. And I can tell you how to prepare for the meetings. So yes and yes and yes. Sign up. Go to your local school board meetings if there's an issue happening. Go to your local public library board meetings. One way to know what's going on, please, 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 if you do one thing tonight, join uniteagainstbookbans.org. I've got a lot of handy bookmarks out there. This is an American Library Association effort to help community members be advocates. And if you include your zip code when you sign up, we can send you an e-blast that says, this issue is taking place, this is what they need help with, here are some talking points, please write this letter or go to this meeting, and we'll send it to everyone in that area. So absolutely become an advocate, and then speak up. Like you said, there are opportunities to demonstrate. There are also opportunities to be a John Scopes today. One of my friends who I've gotten to know through a challenge is Leila Green Little. She's a mom from Llano, Texas. Her family are ranchers there. And she took her kids to her public library, and their favorite books that were basically butt and fart joke books were off the shelf. And the library had removed 17 books because community members felt like they were obscene, harmful to minors. And Leila and a number of other citizens said, no way. This will not fly, and they became plaintiffs in that case. That case has had some ups and some downs, but it is looking very hopeful. And I am so glad that I can know her because she demonstrates the fact that, yes, any person like me can say, this isn't okay, this violates my First Amendment right, this violates my child's First Amendment right. We can be the John Scopes and we can be the Clarence Darrows and we can make that change.
That's great. That is so lovely. We're going to take our questions now. Are you going to read them, Mariella? Okay, great.
Okay, and if you have any other questions, my colleague Kat is collecting them. We have some questions from our online audience as well as our lovely people in person. So the first question is, where do you see the line being drawn between protection of children and diverse ideas, especially pertaining to misinformation?
It's a misconception right now that parents don't have rights and that people don't have options for what they choose. We each have the power to choose what's right for us and what's right for our family. And almost every single English class and school district in the United States has an opt-out already where a parent can say, I don't want my child reading this. Please give them a different title, and the teacher will do that. So we have a right to choose what's right for us. We just don't have a right to remove it for everyone.
Can you comment on the role of billionaire funding that's organizing for these issues going well beyond social media influence?
The question was about billionaires funding these sort of activities, and what can one say? It's the same as with the social media. You have people of tremendous power and money, and they think they can dictate to others what they should be doing. Clearly, we see that now in the federal government, billionaires taking that role. And, I think that what Joyce said about standing up is directly on point, because the billionaires can buy publicity, they can make campaign donations, but ultimately our elected officials rely on voters to be reelected, and there is strength in numbers, and you also can organize, you also can get friends together, you also can use social media to fight back against these things. And by the way, not only can you go to public meetings and confront your elected officials, you can run for library board or school board. And there are resources available to help you do that. So yeah, again, it's a huge challenge, and it's one that we are responsible for rising to.
Pertaining to the book content, do you find that certain genres of books are more vulnerable than others?
Certainly people go after graphic novels. And so to define censorship, anytime you label something, you move it to a different section, you don't have to burn a book or remove it to be censorship. If I'm a school librarian and I think, ooh, my principal may not like this, a parent might complain, I just won't buy it, right? That's soft censorship. And it is, I went on a tangent and lost my train of thought. Oh, graphic novels. And people are encouraged, or they think, I'll just label something or I'll just move it and it will remove the problem. Recently, we've seen a lot of people say, well, we're going to move the entire graphic novel collection into the adults. Then you have a bunch of kids going to the adult collection and seeing material worse than they would have anyways. So graphic novels get attacked. And then as far as topics, viewpoint discrimination is something that you brought up a few minutes ago. Books that involve people of color as characters, book authors of color, anything with LGBTQ content, anything remotely related to sex, like the Roby Harris books that I mentioned, those are being challenged. And that's where, as you noted, in some of the very high-profile Supreme Court cases, they set a precedent saying you cannot remove something just based on viewpoint discrimination. It's unconstitutional.
And some of these topics are perennial. In the book banning case that ended up in the Supreme Court, I don't know, 30 or 40 years ago. Pico, yeah. There was a footnote that named all of the books that were challenged in that case, and some great majority of them were by African American authors. There was a wave of increased book banning back in the aughts, I think, where LGBTQ themed books and authors were the topic of censorship. So, and there was also at that time the Harry Potter books and other books about magic and witches that were thought to be anti-religious. So these topics arise over and over again, and they come in these waves, although this is like nothing I don't think we've seen before, as your numbers indicate.
So what are some unintended consequences that people might not know about when banning books?
I'll list a few, and if you take a look at firstbook.org, that is a wonderful organization, and they recently did a study on the effect of having diverse books in the classroom, and the effect is good. The effect is that people want to read books that show themselves in a mirror. People want to read books that represent their lived history. They need these books. And if you start removing topics, you're going to have whole groups of students and people who don't have access to their lived experience or their history. So it can be very frightening.
It's also sort of a principle of the First Amendment that what you do to other people, they can do to you. So what goes around comes around. Who knows? Maybe the next wave of book bannings is going to be against books and ideas that you, the current banner, care deeply about.
May I add one quick note? For 10 years, I bought politics and religion for Elmhurst Public Library. I can guarantee I did not appreciate every single book in each collection, but like you said, you can't start removing books. We as librarians can't decide what we put in the library and what we don't. We have to cover all topics, current and historic. It's in the Library Bill of Rights.
And librarians as a profession are trained how to curate a collection and how to choose books and how to represent diverse viewpoints. And when you start banning books against the wishes of librarians in particular, you are replacing that professional training and that ability to look at the collection as a whole with individual preferences or spites.
Could you talk a little bit about the book bans that the Secretary of State, Alexi Giannoulias, put in, and how that's impacted the state of Illinois? Has it influenced other states?
So this year last year or the year before, there were a bunch of bills on banning the book bans. And I am only familiar, I don't know which one was Alexi Giannoulias, the one that passed, the one that I'm aware of, basically adopted the American Library Association's Bill of Rights, that said that public libraries and school libraries had to adopt policies that reflected those principles. There were other bills that concerned us at the ACLU because they seemed to be just as you can't ban books based on their topic or their viewpoint. You can't give special protections to books based on their viewpoint, and a lot of the bills, because they were responding to the kinds of bans that we were seeing, were sort of instinctively saying, no, you can't ban books based on X, Y, and Z, because that was what was going on, but you are creating sort of the reverse problem there. But we were happy with the one that was adopted.
Yeah, I would echo that. You said a few minutes ago, things can be flipped, and that's a concern. It is good that this bill encouraged people to follow the Library Bill of Rights in their collection development policies, but bear in mind, each of us also has a right to fill out a reconsideration form, to say we don't believe something belongs somewhere, and to say why. That is our right as well. So we can't remove people's right to say, I don't like this because, or I'm concerned about this because. As a librarian, sometimes we get a reconsideration form and we're like, oh man, that should have been weeded 20 years ago. I mean, that does happen. Or, you know what, this is true. We've looked it over and it does belong in a different location, or it does. So it is part of our job to, as you said, professionally curate that collection and to take each reconsideration form seriously if it's done the proper way. We're not going to take a list of 200 books and say, sure, we'll remove them. But there were several other attempts. California, and I forget what other state, worked on passing a similar bill, and I don't believe they have. Illinois certainly was the first, and it's a good one, but yeah, I'm not familiar with many of them.
Okay, would you call what's happening now sort of a stage of fascism with the book burning and the book banning and all of that? How impactful, or do you see it as reflected of past times where this was more common? It's a big word.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's helpful or not to categorize things as fascist. I mean, what is helpful is to describe what's going on, and what's going on is we are seeing unpopular ideas or ideas that are unpopular with some government officials under threat, and people who express those views under threat of having federal funds canceled, of being deported if they are not a citizen, of being deprived of their clients if they're a law firm. And those are things that we have seen before, and they're extremely frightening signs, and all the more reason why all of us need to stand up and be vocal.
Have any major publishers or famous authors really taken a stand publicly against these same things that seem to work against both their industries?
Absolutely, every single day, thank goodness. In a number of cases, publishers have joined with plaintiffs, with citizens, with the Freedom to Read Foundation and other allied groups with the ACLU to do this work. Librarians and publishers aren't putting obscene and harmful to minor materials into our hands. They are doing their best to get great works by thoughtful authors out to all of us, and they are very involved, and I'm so glad. It is absolutely an effort across the board.
Yeah, and I want to say the American Booksellers Association has also been very, very active and very vocal about this.
All right, we have time for one more question. So, what is your hope for the generations of students today who are becoming more active, are able to come together quicker on social media, and really play a part in their own like school and curriculum? What is your hope for them?
I just want to keep encouraging them, and I hope they keep using their voices. And I want to share an example. There's a Girl Scout in Virginia who, for her Girl Scout Gold Award, similar to an Eagle Scout project, her project was her community. They had removed a number of books from her school in an act of censorship. So she set up little free libraries and other locations where she populated them with these titles. And yeah, right? She was amazing. She worked with a group in her school, and that was her effort. When they went to read her Gold Award, they didn't mention censorship at all. They literally, the people reading it removed all of that. She ended up saying, "Thank you for giving me this opportunity to explain what this project really was, because you did this action." And she received a special citation from the Freedom to Read Foundation. She and many young people in high school and college are speaking out, and I just want to, and anytime you see a student or a young person doing this, please encourage them. Please share your experience, share what you've done throughout your life, and help.
You know, obviously, well, not obviously. I mean, A Handmaid's Tale is up there. Not one of my favorite books, but yeah. That's yours. Thank you for volunteering. That answer was Huckleberry Finn, for those who didn't hear. A classic American banned book.
I'm going to go with a more recent one, The Hate You Give. It was really interesting. That's a book that I read because it kept showing up year after year on the top 10 banned book list. And I was like, I guess I'm curious. I want to understand this. It gave me such insight into a world that I have never been familiar with. And my sons are biracial, and they deal with these topics on a somewhat regular basis, and it was just good for me to understand that and read it, and for the life of me, I don't see why people feel it need to remove it.
I don't know if I have a favorite banned book, but what I'm going to say two things about that. One is the last time we in the bookstore talked about doing, because Banned Book Week comes around every year, and the last time we talked about doing a display, we were like, well, what wouldn't be on it? Because the lists are just getting so large. But I also want to say, like, this is not the world I grew up in. I grew up, going to the library and pulling out any book I wanted. I grew up, I knew where my mother was hiding the books about stuff going on with women in the 70s that she was reading it sort of secretly and hiding it. She was hiding it from my father, not from us, but I knew where it was. And I read all that. And, I think the freedom to read was such a big part of my childhood. And I'm pretty sure that I wasn't warped by it. I was warped by other things, but not that. So I do feel lucky to have grown up in that era. And what I want to say to just close tonight is I've been sitting here thinking about COVID and how that came down upon us, and it was so scary, and we went into lockdown, and the first responders of COVID were the nurses and doctors in the hospitals, and we were going outside and we were banging our pots and pans to say thank you to all those heroic people who were on the front lines of COVID. And I have been sitting here tonight and I'm thinking, when I stop talking, I want you to give a round of applause, not just to Joyce and Rebecca for the amazing job that they did on the panel tonight, but we're sitting here in a library, and thank you, Mariella, and thank you, all the librarians here, because you are our first responders for this crisis, and this is what they're doing every day, and I just really want to thank you for all of that.